Welcome. Thank you for coming. It's amazing to see you all here, if I can say. My name is Francesca Bertolotti-Bailey, and I am the CEO of Cove Park. And I would like to go straight into the program. The remarks and the speeches will happen a bit later. The program starts with a short conversation, between Mae ling Lokko and Chris Stark. Where is Chris? Oh yeah, he's over there, very good. So I'm just going to introduce them to you. Mae ling Lokko is an architectural scientist, a designer, and an educator based between Ghana and the US, where she teaches at Cooper Union and at Yale University. Her work focuses upon the upcycling of agro-waste and biomaterials into highly performative and sustainable building materials. Her research integrates technical, environmental, social, and cultural criteria to question the relationship between value and material. And the reason why she's here with us today is because of a collaborative project between Ghana and Scotland that we have developed together with the British Council Architecture, Design and Fashion, and we have been supported by them. So thank you, Sevra, Parvinder, and Hannah, who are here tonight. You probably have seen the amazing grid shell structure that is outside, and if you haven't, please go and take a look. The weather is with us, so there is no mud. So you can definitely go even with your high heels, kind of. That is the physical manifestation of the project in Scotland. And it's been led by Tom Morton, Scottish architect of Arc Architects over there. Thank you, Tom. And together with a multidisciplinary cohort of young professionals and students from all over the country. Mae ling has been working in Accra, mainly with Ghanaian students, but also she contributed to the structure here with her, let's say, signature mycelium. She will tell you a bit more about this incredible material, which at the moment, it's basically mushrooms, kind of. And I think that they're actually growing at the moment in our boiler room, if I heard that correct. Okay, we're not gonna take anyone there, right? Right? Okay, good. So the project looks at just to conclude so you understand why she's here, the project looks at the impact of climate change on water and especially looks at flooding, which is something that takes place way too often both in Scotland and in Ghana. And focuses upon sustainable and organic design, basically, and to try and understand what that can do to prevent it. Okay, so now it's your turn. Chris Stark is the CEO of the UK Committee on Climate Change. His previous role was Director of Energy and Climate Change in the Scottish Government, where he led Scotland's approach to emissions reduction and energy system transition. The Climate Change Committee is an independent statutory body established under the Climate Change Act in 2008. Its purpose is to advise the UK government and its devolved governments on emissions targets and climate adaptation and to report to Parliament on progress. I will explain a little bit later why the international collaboration that I mentioned and this conversation are crucial for the future of Cove Park. And for now, we'll just say that I am thrilled, delighted, honored, happy to have you both here. I think we're all very, very lucky to have, I would say, maybe like two sustainability visionaries like you speaking together, if I can say. So thank you. Okay, so before I leave you the mic, you have two. I just wanted to say that after this conversation, we will go, and the moment to get another drink or something, then we will go straight into the music, which will take place outside. And I would like to announce now, since this was basically embargoed until today, that we will have the pleasure to listen to CKTRL, a South London producer, and multi-instrumentalist. And I am ecstatic at the idea of this happening tonight. Some of you probably know him, some of you don't, but hey. So we will go straight into that. And one last thing, the conversation is recorded, so please make sure your phone is on silent if possible. And here you go. Enjoy. See you later.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Chris. Now, Francesca is someone who I've met recently through an unusual link through my neighbour, who is on the board of the Cove Park, and Nadia's at the back there, along with my wife Marianne. And Francesca said, "Come along, and we'll have you along, and you can talk about climate change." And I thought, great. And I said, "What do you want me to talk about?" And she said, "You can decide." So we are going to have an unstructured discussion between us. Hopefully it will be a little more structured than that. And hopefully that will give you a nice introduction to tonight's festivities. So I'm going to start with a question, if I can, and a very simple question, which is, what's all this about? So tell us a bit about the project.
Good evening, everyone. This is super interesting to have a conversation in front of all of you. We're going to try and keep it informal and friendly. But the project, Future by Design, we chose to focus it around problems around water. In Ghana, we've had some really catastrophic flooding. And about 3 years ago, we had a flood that led to a huge gas explosion in the capital city in Accra. And so basically, it's front and center in terms of national, security. It's front and center in terms of making the impacts of climate change visible. There's nothing more visible than a bomb, right? So the project for us was trying to figure out ways of understanding the way in which water patterns have changed in the city, and how, yes, climate change is affecting all of this, but there are so many things that we are doing that are exacerbating the problem. And so in Ghana, the project was very much about finding a place in the city that was at the worst locus of all of these problems coming together: flooding, building, the lack of biodiversity. And so we worked with a group of students to actually think through the problems. So it was a very exploratory process that was quite similar as Tom had here in Scotland. Although our site was incredibly public, it was in the only park in Ghana, the only green space in Ghana. Here it's in sort of a private, almost rural setting, but we discovered a lot of parallels. And one of the big things that the project, and this sort of turned in the direction that we didn't expect, it centered around seeds. Introducing materials that are super good at holding water and actually making productive use of them in a circular way to grow. And so we're hoping to integrate some seeds here as well of wildflowers that we have in the landscape to also deal with erosion on the side of the structure as well. So that's a little bit about what the project is, but there was a lot of building. It was very hands-on. There was a lot of discussions. We had a lot of virtual exchanges on both sides. And we're yet to see where both projects will lead, but they're two very different, but a lot of parallel, topics that both of us are dealing with, both in Scotland and in Ghana.
So let me take this in a slightly different direction. So my job day to day is to advise on what to do about climate change. And we are at this kind of high level, I suppose you could say. We're thinking about things like emissions targets. So we're going to have COP26 near here in Glasgow in just a few weeks' time. Yeah. We're going to be talking about the global ambition to tackle climate change. And I think a lot of the discussion is going to be global. The fascinating thing for me is that you are doing something at the front line about it. And I suppose my next question to you might be, what do you think that people like me, who are up there in the clouds somewhere, can learn from a project like this in terms of the advice that we should be giving to governments, to world leaders, to the people who will be here in COP26 in a few weeks' time?
Wow, yeah, switching roles, switching positions. I think, I might go back to what I learned from the project over the last 3 months, which was getting all the stakeholders on the same table and understanding how somebody's problem is shared by a number of different people. And so what was interesting about the public project was that we had a politician I wanted to deal with climate change, but also with flooding issues in the city as well as security. We had a park that was fighting developers because a very intense structure is going to be put up there. It's right in the center of the city, really high land and property values. We had a church that's one of the most prominent, neighbors near the park, and there's obviously a hotel, the Kempinski Hotel. So for some reason, that entire site was incredibly charged, not just because the land was going to be converted into something else, but everyone around there had some stake, in the project. In terms of bringing everybody together and seeing what someone's problem could be a solution for the other, we needed a lot of incentives. And so there's a lot of things around, who manages urban property, zoning, huge over there. People are building in actually flood zones.
Yeah.
So enforcing that is critical, but also rewarding when people actually do things right. Developers, what actually gets built is never seen as part of the green infrastructure that can deal with climate change. So instead of seeing that as separate, like an add-on green roof or, I don't know, some kind of energy efficient envelope system, those only are sort of incredibly segregated approaches or solutions to the bigger problem. But all of a sudden, if your green roof is part of the park, or the people who are basically selling around the streets that are a security problem are part of the urban farming community in terms of maintaining what we built, in terms of the bioswale, then those things are incredibly integrated. It's job creation, it's learning a lot of skills, it's also rewarding people for doing innovative things as part of a building, sector solution. So encouraging those type of things, and I think, incentives, tax breaks, things like encouraging people to build buildings, to follow certain types of international green standards or possibly go beyond it. Those are all things that are great to see. Like a collaboration like this, for example, sponsored by the British Council, allows us to actually integrate all of these, different things. The flooding problem is a biodiversity problem and also a building sector problem. So,
do you think the reality of where we are on climate change is understood in Ghana or here for that matter? I mean, I declare an interest. I don't think it is. So I don't think we are well adapted at all in terms of the built environment, at least, to the kind of changes to the climate that we'll experience.
Yeah, I think in Ghana, when you talk about sustainability and green building materials, it's a luxury. It's very expensive. And it's only when you lens it through things that actually affect people, for example, flooding, a bomb explosion, when it's considered like an obstacle to daily life, that's when people begin to see that. Health is another big one, particularly in terms of our food table. You think about all the food that we import into the country. We import 70% of our food, and now we also import 75% of all our building materials. So the costs are growing bigger and bigger and bigger. So you feel it in your pockets because the things that should actually produce these types of resources are no longer affordable. Then indirectly, yes, people feel the impacts of climate change, but it's never a direct relationship. I don't know if that's the same in Scotland, is it?
It is the same. I think it is the same. The big challenges in Scotland are, in terms of the climate that we have a set of buildings that were constructed for a different climate. So we're gonna face a whole set of challenges in adapting to them. I live in with Nadia and Marianne at the back. We live in a building that struggles now with the deluge of water that we receive when it rains. So that idea of kind of strong weather coming with climate change means that we're going to have big challenges in adapting the buildings that we have already. And then this other challenge, which I think is ultimately the biggest one, of how you decarbonize those buildings. For me, the interesting thing there is that much of what I do in my job is looking at the kind of national scale. So we will advise on closing a coal-fired power plant and replacing it with an offshore wind farm. And that's easy, actually. That's a kind of easy piece of advice to give. People don't feel very engaged in that. Fascinating thing for me is if you want to decarbonize a building, it will be very different in Glasgow to the challenge in Cornwall to the challenge in Ghana. And it's a kind of hyper-local thing. And for me, that's often presented as a barrier to tackling the problem of decarbonising that building. Actually, I think that's the answer. It means you need to have a plan for decarbonisation that is owned by the people who live in that place. And I think when you open it up like that, you can really get into the question of what you need to do about it. I did a brilliant thing. In the last 2 years, I worked on a thing called the Citizens' Assembly on Climate Change, which was a kind of UK-wide thing. I have to say I went into it quite reluctantly because our job is to do kind of technical analysis on how you tackle climate change. So we sit with spreadsheets and work out how to do it. And the idea of a citizens' assembly is that you can bring together a group of people who are representative of the population and ask them what to do about climate change. And I'll be honest, when I was invited to be part of it, I thought, I'm not sure I want to do this because it's going to undermine what we do. And of course, that's rubbish. You know, it turns out there was 110 people very carefully selected from around the UK to be representative of the population by age, by ethnicity, also by what they thought about climate change. And really interesting, when you get into this issue of how you decarbonise an economy, the things they want to talk about are not how you do it. They kind of don't care whether it's a heat pump or a gas boiler or concrete construction or wood. What they want is to know whether they'll be involved in it. And I think that's, for me, really interesting that 2 years later, we haven't really grasped that in this country, how you bring people into the challenge of tackling climate change properly. I don't know whether you agree.
No, completely. I mean, I think that in a lot of the work that I do, which is around waste, and finding ways to actually transform that waste into new types of building technologies that aren't passive. You know, they don't just sit there. They actually are participating in the energy performance of the building. You realize that a lot of our measures for decarbonization, for reducing emissions, are quite punitive. So if you don't do this, there's a fine, or if you don't do this, your waste is not going to get picked up.
Yeah.
But what really is going to drive that is a cultural change. And frankly, it's about changing people's rituals at home, right? Like if you actually were excited and you were going to generate some value out of taking care of your trash, then you would do it. It's what you just do after you wash the dishes. And making that a habit is more powerful than a punitive system. And that's the most difficult thing to do. It's not that technologies don't exist. In fact, the vernacular here with the turf roofs, earth architecture in Ghana, it's well understood. And there have been many ways of showing that these are fantastic ways of managing the building's energy performance. But really, they're not aspirational in the way that, you know, modern technologies have become. We don't understand their performance. We don't nurture them as aspirational material technologies. They're, you know, the communities and societies that used to develop these pieces of architecture, these systems of architecture, they've changed. And so how do we re-envision a new way of building, you know, as a community, as a neighborhood, as a region? And so that aspirational aspect and how people are actually part of that process is something that we're not even beginning to prototype in a realistic way. You know, it happens in small projects like this, like the one in Ghana.
And you need
But how do you scale that up? And so it's a cultural phenomenon that we need to actually engage with and activate. And that's why working in, you know, contexts like this, like art institutions, cultural institutions, it's not just about the communication, but it's how do you get people into the actual process of working, of building, of understanding what they're doing, so that it does become part of their, you know, their local street, you know, or their rituals on a daily basis in their homes. So
tell me about the mushrooms.
Okay, I have a secret. I am sick to death of mushrooms. I'm just joking. They're amazing. So there are millions of strains of mushrooms around the world. And I've been working with a technology that basically takes baby mushrooms, mycelia, and you feed them with waste from agriculture. And they basically eat it all up over the course of 5 days, and they grow into a pretty interesting building material. It can be as light as insulation to replace packaging, and a number of companies have done that. Dell Computers, BMW almost replaced all their insulation, but they couldn't get past the smell of mushrooms. We love the smell of the new car, all those VOCs. Cultural change, right?
Cars will change.
We need to figure out,
Earthy
exactly.
cars. That's what we need.
But we found strains of mycelium that actually eat certain things and give out new smells like vanilla. So if you like vanilla, you want to smell that every day. Maybe that's possible. I don't know. But they grow over 5 days. And what's great about it is it happens at room temperature. You cover it up so there's a lot of humidity. So the mushrooms have everything they need to grow. But before they flower, you put them out in the sun and they dry up. As long as the moisture goes down below 10%, they'll never grow again. Which is kind of sad because now I've realized we're just building a cemetery of fungi. But the fact that they played a role in transforming something that was a waste material is great. So yeah, there's a lot of applications in the building sector, from insulation to acoustic panels, depending on how you process them. But
and it's a big challenge to people like me. So we give advice about what materials could be used in buildings, and we think mainly about concrete and steel and how you can minimize the use of those things. But the other thing we think about is biomass.
Sure, yeah.
And growing a tree, using a tree in a building is a really good use of that tree because it locks away carbon for a very long time. Like the average in this country is 700 years. So if you build a building with wood, that carbon's in there for 700 years. But we don't think about mushrooms. And maybe we should.
Yeah, they're in a large population below the ground. We haven't quite figured out, how to use them and scale them up. I mean, yes, if you talked about this 7 years ago, this was like, are you kidding us? Everyone's afraid of fungi. Well, not everyone, but a lot of people are. And now it's actually pretty accepted in industries. You have brands that are using them for cosmetics, L'Occitane and Dell. If they can use it, everyone feels safer. But I think unless this technology becomes something that is incredibly accessible, so someone can take waste from their kitchen, take a strain of mycelium that they get at their local grocery store, and can grow it in their cupboards or under their beds, as we talked about today, then it's never going to scale up. But in the sort of industry, there are a lot of interesting business models now, where you have companies that are actually there to grow everything for you and ship them to you. So we're seeing a new type of industry coming out of this. The farm sends all their waste to this company, they culture the mycelium, and then they send out new products.
It's amazing.
So it's kind of interesting to see that. But any other types of building materials that you think are quite interesting?
Well, we look at the carbon content of all these things. So steel is a particular problem, but we think we can fix that. So you can make steel without burning coking coal. Concrete, more of an issue, actually. And our general view is that you could use more natural products, especially wood, in construction, even to build tall buildings. But we run up against regulators who don't allow it.
Yeah.
So, that's frustrating. So I could point to some amazing examples of buildings in Northern Europe that are built with wood.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't be allowed to build them in this country. So there's this kind of
totally,
this barrier that we reach with regulation.
Yeah, actually, that's something you could help us on. Like if you were trying to get a material like mycelium into a building, the stack of things you need to meet, how does the dust affect your respiratory system when you cut it? So all of a sudden, an architect has to figure out how to test that. The barriers are incredibly high. And also, we have new tools for figuring out how materials actually improve the operations of a building. But we actually haven't used those same tools to understand how vernacular architecture performed. So there's a lot of things we need to do in terms of rethinking the performance of natural building materials and actually improving our standards. You can't test a biomaterial the same way you test wood. They grew a very different way. They're going to break and, fail a very specific way. And so those new standards are certain, barriers that, a lot of people in the biomaterials industry face. In fact, most biomaterial companies I know have failed, which is tragic. but it's those type of things we're meeting. But yeah, I mean, I'm super interested through this project. I've been learning a lot about amazing materials here in Scotland.
Which
from-
materials? Tell us.
So first of all, moss.
Right, God.
It's amazing. Living roofs.
Yeah.
Cob, which I know Tom's wife works with, or earth as well. My advisor worked with cob, and what's interesting is cob is a material that breathes. So moisture and temperature-wise, it's very good at regulating what's happening on the outside of your building and allowing you to still feel comfortable.
Yeah, of course.
So in terms of natural materials, those two have been super interesting. There's a lot of things Tom has been doing with like natural fibers and seaweeds on some of his trips that I've been seeing, which we don't have in our part of the world. I mean, your ecology here is on steroids. In Ghana, it takes forever because it's so hot. We burn everything with the heat. But so yeah, it's interesting to learn.
I know, and
about
I feel Tom should be up. We'll meet him later, I'm sure, when we got to the structure. But we'll hear all about it. Now I'm going to kind of wrap this up if I can. I can go back to that top level thing that we were talking about earlier. So we've got COP26 coming up.
Yeah.
Which is only a few weeks away, but I'm not sure, me included, I'm not sure we know quite what this thing's going to be like. So we're going to have this big moment coming up post-COVID where 30, 40,000 people are going to come to the city of Glasgow, just down the road. And I suppose I want to ask you, what should they be discussing when it comes to the issues that we've talked about tonight? What would be the message back to those world leaders when they arrive in Glasgow? Amazingly, we're going to have the Pope, Joe Biden, Putin, probably, President Xi, strolling Sauchiehall Street. If you had something to tell them about the challenge on construction, the challenge on materials, what would it be?
I actually don't think it's a materials problem. I think it's a mindset around comfort in buildings, in our lives, that we've become so accustomed to. Where I'm from, comfort is part of an aspiration to develop very quickly. That's why we like concrete, glass, and steel. It's the materials of modernity.
Yeah.
If I show coconuts and mushrooms in Ghana, it is a tough crowd. It really is. And so this question about comfort, I think, links a lot of things. The ways in which we've defined comfort in our buildings are very much based on other industries. Like we've inherited refrigeration from the food industry, and we've conditioned our buildings that way, and it's all static, it's very set. Yeah. But as humans, we have many ways of experiencing comfort, from hot to cold, and there's so many other things like light and all of these things in our buildings that give us comfort. And we need to figure out new ways of, first of all, living with discomfort in an aspirational way. It means having more of an active relationship with your body. Sweat is not bad, So it's more of a philosophical question, really. How do we nurture new forms of comfort? How do we redefine how we feel comfortable in our environments? Because we're used to so many luxuries that are driving what we're seeing in terms of emissions, in terms of building consumption patterns. And those things are only the symptoms of something that is quite personal, which is comfort, I think. So I don't know. I don't know really how you attack that multi-pronged, heavy problem like comfort. But I think, building a natural aspiration around things that address changing standards of comfort can happen in the building sector, it can happen in the food sector, it can happen in all aspects of industry. But they're all very different.
Wow, that's amazing. So, I can tell you that there isn't a day themed around comfort at COP26. Perhaps there should be.
Just put it on, lens it through other things like emissions. Yeah, which you totally can. Yeah. And what would you hope to be talking about during COP26?
Well, because I'm in the clouds, so I really hope that we talk about the things ultimately that will change the story on climate. So the big theme in COP26 is going to be whether we can keep on the table this outcome of 1.5 degrees centigrade. And it's really tough, really, really tough. So you're going to hear a lot about net zero which is this kind of target by mid-century that really we all need to be signed up to. But we also need something in the short term, which is these short-term emissions reductions. And the focus will be on national commitments. But the interesting thing for me at COP26 is that if you peer through those national commitments, what drives them is the kind of things we've been talking about today, actually, the kind of construction challenge, for example, the challenge on energy, the challenge on consumption generally. Are we willing to change our patterns of consumption? So I hope a lot of that comes to the fore in COP26, because actually the confidence of world leaders to sign up to these targets is really driven by our willingness to make those changes. And the interesting thing for me is how achievable that goal of net zero by mid-century really is now. We can make these changes. It's really only a question of our willingness to do it. It's not about the cost of it any longer. It's about the kind of inertia in the system. So I hope some of the issues that we talk about, whether we have a themed day on comfort or not, I hope some of these issues unlock, I suppose, some of the easier paths to that outcome. And I suppose as a proud Glaswegian, I hope that Glasgow is associated with that change when it happens. Because we will do it. It's a question of how quickly we do it and whether we do it easily or whether we make it hard. So I'm going to end there, Francesca, if that's all right. I'm getting the eye, so I think that must be the end. So just say thank you very much, and thank
Thanks,
you to Mae ling.
Chris.